I want to talk about a system for torturing, yes, torturing Trumpsters that has now been in effect since January 6th, imposed by the Biden prosecutors. And this is a system of solitary confinement for people charged very often with minor offenses. At one point, according to the government itself, all the January 6 detainees, the people arrested, were in solitary confinement. I'm going to get to what that means and why it's particularly horrific. But I want to start by talking about the fact that to justify this extreme response, the left has been talking about insurrection, sedition, riots, terrorism. Now, all of that could have occurred on January 6th. In fact, there's a very interesting article in American Greatness by Dan Galernter. It's called "What Would a Real Capitol Hill Riot Look Like?" And Galernter plays out a thought experiment. He says, one word from Trump. If Trump had basically just said something like, listen, our election has been stolen from us. I want all of you to get all your weapons and come to Washington, D.C., and let's have a violent uprising. Dan's point, the writer, Dan Galernter, is that that would have occurred. That would have been a real insurrection, and it would not have been pretty. It would have actually been terrifying. If Trump, he says, had 1 ounce of the authoritarian, dictatorial tendencies attributed to him, he could have done it. Trump is one of the few people who has the ability to, in a sense, you may almost say provoke, not just insurrection, but civil war. And this is not just something that Trump could have done prior to January 6th. Trump could do it now. He's one of the few people who has the kind of support in the country where if he were to rally people to take to arms, they would. But the point is that Trump is not that kind of a guy. This is, I think, Galernt's point, that this is the left sort of fiction about Trump. But Trump's actions, really from the outset, show that this is never what he was about. This is not what he was seeking on January 6th. And now there's a DC Medical Examiner report about the 5 people who died on January 6th. 4 were Trump supporters. 2 died of a heart attack. 1 of amphetamine poisoning. 1, a Trumpster, Ashley Babbitt, from homicide, but the homicide was perpetrated by a Capitol Hill policeman. The manner of death of Officer Sicknick is still unknown. We know that he was not killed by being hit on the head with a fire extinguisher, as the New York Times, many other media outlets report. How he died remains unknown. The left continues to whip up a frenzy about January 6th, most recently when there was the guy this is the Nation of Islam supporter who rammed his car into a barricade in Washington, D.C., killing a Capitol Hill policeman. And by the way, it had nothing to do with January 6th. But right after it happens, the January 6th prosecutors go running into court and they say, we continue to have concerns about safety at the Capitol, as though this other incident is somehow further evidence of the need to maintain maximum militarization and maximum vigilance. Now, on top of this, we have an article in Politico that points out, it's titled, Most Capitol Rioters Unlikely to Serve Jail Time. And what they mean is that when you actually look at what many of these people did, it's essentially a big fat nothing. Some of them walked into the Capitol unobstructed. They did no physical damage to anything. They milled around, essentially, waving signs, maybe shouting. But here's Politico. Americans outraged by the storming of Capitol Hill are in for a jarring reality check. Many of those who invaded the halls of Congress on January 6th are likely to get little or no jail time. A Politico analysis, almost a quarter of the 230 defendants so far charged with only misdemeanors. Things like trespassing, being in the wrong place. This is unauthorized area of the Capitol. You can't be inside. That's it. They didn't do anything. They didn't harm anybody. Now, given all this, it is particularly, I think, horrifying that the government has been using what it's somewhat euphemistic language is called, restrictive housing, these kinds of terms that are used to take people who have, by the way, they have not been tried, they have not been convicted of anything. They are presumed innocent. So why is the government placing them in cells which are essentially the size of a parking space at the grocery store? And they are in 23-hour lockdown. And what this means is that for 23 hours, they get no access to the outdoors, in some cases, no light, and no reading, no social interaction with anybody except a surly guard who shows up to hand you your food and then leaves. So this, I think, try to imagine yourself in this situation. It is a form of torture. Yes, there's no really getting around it. I'm trying to mentally envision myself sitting in a room, a tiny room with nothing in it. And I'm sitting there for 23 hours. I wake up, it's the same. All day, it's the same. And all I get for 1 hour is to go outside, very often in shackles with the guards. And there's also, so this is going on. We see it's happened to the teenager, Bruno Kua. It's happened to to Lisa Eisenhart. It's happened to the guy who runs the group called Cowboys for Trump. It's happened to Christopher Kuhn. So all these guys are treated essentially as if they are, they're like death row inmates. Now, death row inmates are sometimes given this treatment, the 23-hour lockdown. And it's widely understood to be much more restrictive than normal custody. In normal custody, you mill around, you're part of this larger group of people who are incarcerated. But it's very different. But death row inmates have been studied, and by and large, this does tremendous psychological harm. In fact, they even talk about something here in the literature. It's called death row syndrome. It's a psychological disorder. It not only produces suicidal tendencies among death row inmates, but psychotic delusions. Why? Because basically human beings are social animals. And keeping us isolated for long periods of time like this in a sort of dark cell, in a sense where all you have is yourself to deal with, hour after hour after hour, it drives you nuts. The United Nations has spoken out on this. They talk about the fact that that this kind of solitary confinement causes permanent changes to people's brains and to their personalities. It tends to diminish your capacity to remember things even later. There's a physical impact on your brain and on the cells that have to do with memory. And it causes something called social pain. And social pain is something that endures even afterwards. It's essentially the memory of a kind of psychological pain. Now, what I'm getting at is that this is the way to treat maybe terrorists, maybe death row inmates who have massacred a whole bunch of people. In those cases, you say, well, listen, these are people who have forfeited their rights. They don't have a right to decent treatment. They have taken away the rights of others. But in the case of the January 6th defendants, these are citizens who have not been found guilty of anything. Some of them are charged with minor offenses where it's very unlikely that they will be locked up at all. So why are they being locked up now? Many of these DC judges are Obama judges, they're Clinton judges, and some of them have raised questions about what the government is trying to do. The bottom line of it is the Biden administration, Merrick Garland, the Biden prosecutors, they're treating Trumpsters as foreign enemies. In some cases, treating them as bad or worse as Islamic terrorists who were involved in 9/11 and other similar incidents. This is a horrific way to treat your political opposition. I think it breeds the very kind of extremism that they claim to be wanting to fight. And quite honestly, it reminds me of something that Lincoln once said when he's talking about slavery. He said, when I see people talking about the wonders of slavery, I feel a strong desire to see it tried on them personally. So when I see these prosecutors and in some cases even judges blithely talking about torturing other people, I feel a strong desire that it happened to them. And by the way, the political pendulum does and can shift. So there may be an opportunity for our side to grab a hold of these guys, charge them with offenses. And again, who knows if they'll be convicted. But in the meantime, lock them up in a small room the size of a parking space, turn out the lights, keep them in there for 23 hours, and then talk to them afterwards about how it feels for them.